A prichádzame teraz už k našej poslednej prezentácii a ja vítam na pódiu pani Ninu Berman, kde sme už vlastne zažili nové formy rozprávačstva v novinárčine, od reportáží, od dlhých písaní cez virtuálnu realitu, až teraz po vlastne veľmi takú zaujímavú kampaň, aj internetovú, aj formou krátkych filmov. Pani Berman zo Spojených štátov amerických sa venuje hlavne fotožurnalizmu a pôsobí, je profesorkou žurnalistiky na University v Columbia, samozrejme jedna zo slávnych amerických univerzít, a je členkou fotografickej agentúry NOR a je autorkou dvoch oceňovaných kníh Purple Hearts, Back from Iraq a Homeland. A samozrejme venuje sa svojej veľkej téme a to je Amerika vo vojnách, Amerika a jej militarizmus a podobné vážne témy a bude nám rozprávať o tom, ako sa vlastne vyvinul fotožurnalizmus do súčasnej podoby a čo nám môže ponúknuť pri rozprávaní príbehov. Nina Berman, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being with us.
No, I don't need that. Thank you, everyone. That was quite a remarkable presentation that we just saw, and I think for me personally, it's been a really useful, productive, moving day. So thank you to the organizers for inviting me, for everyone sticking around. I want to speak about counter-narratives, meaning stories that run counter to the dominant media frame and the dominant political message, two things that are often aligned. First, a little background on me. I work as an independent photographer, so I do hope my presentation will inspire the independent journalists out there. I'm a member of a photo collective called NOR. We're based in Amsterdam. There are 14 of us working around the world. I'm a professor at Columbia University in New York City, where I run the photo department in the Graduate School of Journalism. I started my professional career as a photographer in 1989. I worked for major magazines covering stories in the US, in Afghanistan and Bosnia, in Mexico, China, and other places. I measured my success by whether my pictures were published. And so I would be sent someplace, or I would pitch a story, and if the magazines ran the images, I felt like I had done my job. This worked for me up to a point, and then it started to feel unsatisfying and even compromised. And so I needed a way to make my work live beyond the printed page. I wanted more control over the context in which my work was seen. I wanted to speak more directly to the people who were looking at my pictures and to reach people who would not normally see my work. Also, I found that my own interests were becoming increasingly at odds with the priorities of a corporate-dominated media, which meant I needed to find new partners and forge creative collaborations to tell these counter-narratives in a way that had meaning for me and also meaning for the people in my photographs. And so I want to present to you a couple projects that I feel had some degree of success, walk you through how I did them and the decisions that I made. My first attempt at working this way was in 2003 with a project called Purple Hearts, back from Iraq, which were portraits and interviews with severely wounded American veterans of the Iraq War. To give you a little background, in 2003, the United States started bombing Iraq in March 2003. About half the country was against the war, the other half was pro-war. The population had really been primed to believe that Saddam Hussein was an immediate threat to the United States. And so there were stories of potential nuclear mushroom clouds, and there was a tremendous sense of fear. The news media, for the most part, I would say, was kind of lockstep in with this political program. And what you had most journalists doing was working as embedded reporters. This was a very crafty, successful move that the Pentagon made to invite journalists, hundreds of journalists, to embed with a military unit. So what that meant was journalists got a free ride into the action, had a very narrow view of the war. They would go with one platoon or one unit and report just on that small space around them. For TV, this was fantastic because it meant that their journalists were, one, going to be protected, two, they didn't have to do any real reporting, they just kind of went along with the program. And what you had on American television was almost a kind of war as entertainment spectacle with different chapters. I personally found this very disturbing, and I wanted to find a way to document this war from a different angle that would provide some kind of sobriety, some more serious perspective. So at this time, there were no pictures being shown of dead people, of dead Americans, dead Iraqis, wounded Americans, wounded Iraqis. But you would hear it sometimes on the newspaper, on the radio, 3 wounded today, or see, in a paper, 5 wounded today. But no one saw actually a wounded person. Pictures of coffins coming back to an Air Force base, which is a kind of classic American photograph. This was denied. So the press was forbidden to take these pictures. So I decided on my own to track down and find these wounded soldiers. I had no idea what I was going to find. There were no lists. There are still no lists of wounded soldiers. There's lists of dead soldiers, but not wounded soldiers. And so the only people reporting on this story were the local newspapers who would have, reports like, Johnny Jones, football star, wounded in Iraq, and I would do searches for these stories by plugging in words like bomb, brain, arm, head, hero. And this was the first person I found. I would call up once I figured out where they were. I'd say, hi, I'm a photographer in New York City. I'm doing a portrait project on Purple Heart recipients. Purple Heart is a medal you get if you've been wounded by the enemy or wounded in enemy fire. So this is Jeremy Fellbush. This is his bedroom. What I would do is interview them for maybe an hour, sometimes 2 hours. I recorded their interviews. I wanted to know why they joined the military, what happened to them. He is blind. He is brain damaged. He was 3 weeks into the war. And then I would take their portrait. And 2 days later, I met this young man, Sam Ross, also blind, an amputee. He was living alone in a trailer at the end of a dirt road. And so I felt a feeling that I think many journalists get when they come upon a story that is not being reported, that feels so distressing. These were secret stories. And then there were also stories not just of the Iraq War, but of American society. So this is Alan Jermaine Lewis. He lost both of his legs. And I asked him, well, did you think you were ever going to be wounded? And he said, well, death has always been around. And then he detailed me all the people who had been killed in his life from a young age, killed not in Iraq, but in the streets of Chicago. So he lost his father, he lost his best friend, he lost his sister, all in acts of violence. And so it occurred to me that young men and women were joining the military to save their lives, which is a really quite deep concept. So I pitched this story to my clients that I was working with, the New York Times Magazine, Newsweek, Time Magazine, and people were not interested. I got one magazine to say I could use their name, that this may be in this magazine when I would approach people. And then finally, Time Magazine gave me some money. They had a big spread of like 6 pages laid out, and then a story about Russell Crowe's new movie knocked my soldier story off the magazine, and a big spread turned into like a 1-pager. So I'm sure other people have had this experience in this room where a story you feel really passionate about is then set aside for something that seems quite frivolous. And so, but this experience was actually the best thing that ever happened to me, because I was so mad, I was so infuriated, I felt so committed to this that I decided, well, I'm going to continue on. Whereas if they had published the pictures, I probably would have felt satisfied. and then the work really would have had a very thin life, and it's had a very big life. So I continued. I ended up doing, I photographed over 20 people in about 8 months. Part of the success of the project was that I played with the concept. Aesthetically, I played with people's conventional image of a wounded soldier. So when I would close my eyes and I'd think wounded soldier, I think of a guy on the battlefield, maybe a helicopter, maybe a stretcher, all these people around him pulling him to safety, or a doctor working on a soldier in the hospital. My pictures are completely opposite from that. First of all, they're seen alone for the most part, which is very troubling because in American society, we like to think that we are helping our veterans. So that was the one thing that got people's attention. The other thing is, for the most part, they're not in uniform. They're not in a hospital. They've already been fixed up, and they don't look so good. And so that was another thing that was very difficult. And I think the difficulty in looking at the pictures and the originality of the aesthetic helped drive the project's success. I did photograph one with his wife. So I'm just going to run through some of these. When I first started the project, I imagined that the soldiers would be very angry about the war. And so I thought they would say, oh, this war was for nothing, and I'm so mad, and I'm really anti-war. That's not what I found. And so, in many ways, that was the most interesting part. And so it made me question the ideology and also the power of the military in their lives. So I photographed them at an extremely vulnerable moment. They had been in the hospital, then they had just been released and sent home. Many of them had run away from their homes because their home life was either so bad or their possibilities for the future were so grim. And so now they were back, making this transition from, able-bodied warrior who's like the baddest boy on the planet, right, or so they're told, to a disabled young veteran who physically and maybe psychologically has deep needs. And so I would pair these pictures, which I hope you find extremely compassionate and empathetic, with these texts, which were sometimes quite different. And this would create a jarring experience for the viewer because they realized that it wasn't just about veterans' care, but about everything that went into their decisions to join, and also the desire to be the baddest boy on the planet. So for instance, this one who I photographed in uniform, he talks about training, and then you get to play, and about how you lit people up, and all of this, and it was very distressing to then look at someone and feel compassionate about what happened to them, and then to see basically the mentality of a trained killer. This particular young man, I asked him why he joined. He said, well, the recruiter called my house looking for my brother, but I answered the phone, and then you get to wear a cool uniform. And so I met one soldier who really questioned the entire war effort. He was the only one that wondered about the enemy. Who was the enemy? And why is he the enemy? And this is Robert Acosta, who was 19 years old at the time. And so I decided, with a grant from the Open Society Foundation, to take Robert on the road. And me and Robert ran around the country, and we started visiting high schools. So in the United States, we have a volunteer military. You're recruited in high school. So recruiters visit the schools. Recruiters call your home. Recruiters go to your football games, your band practice. They become your good friend. They offer you signing bonuses. And this is a very elaborate mechanism. And so we wanted to go into schools not explicitly as counter-recruiters, but to show students that there is another story, right? So we never went in, we never said we are against this war. I never told one student that. It was like, here is another story, another experience that you may not be seeing. and we're going to present it to you. So this was shocking for these young people for many reasons. One, they had never seen pictures like this. Robert was a fantastic partner to have. He was extremely honest. But also what I discovered is that seeing these images opened up all these other stories for the children about violence in their own community. So sometimes pictures can do that, you know, and I think in many ways that's their strength, is that you see a picture and maybe it's connected to one person, to that person in the picture, but it can bring out all these other emotions. So I would get letters from high school students saying, you know, this reminds me of my brother who is in prison now, or this reminds me of this. And that's when I felt like I was really onto something, and that this project had some very deep meaning. So we went to high schools, we went to colleges, and the way I kind of would organize it is that we would have a sort of three-pronged strategy when we hit a location. We would try and get into a high school, we would try and get into a university, and then we were trying to have an exhibition, because the exhibition brought in the press. So you go and you visit a high school, no one's going to cover your visit, right? You go and you visit a college, maybe you'll get a write-up in the college newspaper. But you have an exhibition, then all of a sudden it's a published author with a Purple Heart veteran, and it brings in the local press. So this helped amplify the whole endeavor. So the exhibitions would vary. They would be pop-ups like this, or, you know, and like this would be the typical of the kind of coverage. And in that way, this work for me became very widely seen, to the point that today these pictures are still pictures that are being used to talk about wounded veterans and the experience of war. So this is in Oakland, California. And we would try and go into populations that were being targeted by recruiters. So there would be times where I'd be talking, and I'd say, is anyone here currently talking to a recruiter? And the hands would go up. And then they had an opportunity to ask questions, to tell their story, because when they go and talk to a recruiter, they're usually not with their parents. So it's the power of the recruiter and the child. So this is just me and Robert, a little pop-up thing. I started in this when I was a new mom, so I brought my little daughter with me. And then there's a museum in Chicago called the National Vietnam Veterans Art Museum. And I had an exhibition there, and there were about 500 veterans. And I got hammered publicly on television. What are you doing with these pictures? This is what lost the Vietnam War for us. What's your purpose? What's your agenda? And every time, what are you trying to do? What are you saying? You know, what's your hidden agenda? And what saved me and saved the project was that there was never any political, explicit political message. The text of the project were the veterans' own words from the interviews. And for me, it was always, these are pictures I'm taking of them. These are their words. And this allowed me to move through worlds that normally I probably wouldn't be able to move through. So I can show it at, a kind of lefty exhibition space in Oakland, and I can show it at a very intensive pro-military space in Chicago. And so this was something that was a great piece of information for me to learn. I did a short film. Let's see if I can show you a little bit of that.
We have to get in for you.
It's okay, I'm not going to go from the beginning. I'll just... Yeah, so...
Last memory is being in charge of the...
I don't know if you can hear it, but some of the soldiers are brain damaged.
With the kids in my way. I take them with me the Veterans Hospital.
It's hard to hear, but he's basically saying that he takes his wife and children to the Veterans Hospital. But when people hear the sound of someone brain damaged, it's very effective. It's very deep. You understand the struggle of that person trying to communicate. This film, which was basically still pictures in my audio interviews that I realized I needed to cobble together, because when I was transcribing the audio tapes, I personally became very moved by the sound of their voices. And so I made this little film, which became very useful for me, because if I couldn't be in a place to talk about the work, I could just send people the little video, and they could play it themselves. A Dutch production company, Dutch TV, did a feature-length documentary on the work, so that was shown at Sundance and on television, and the pictures and the text were published in 10, 12 countries. So one reason I think for this success, hold on, let me figure out where I am again. So this was the kind of the distribution. I would work with veterans groups, but they were never the primary, there was never one NGO. And that was important, because if I was working with just one NGO, then the response could be, oh, this is just propaganda, or this is just promotional material for this NGO. So I would partner with them, as in, would you like to buy some books? You know, can I give a talk? Do you have a veteran I can use from your organization? Universities, high schools, people would just start sending me emails. Can you come to this place? Can you bring Purple Arts here? I had a veteran who worked in a senior citizen center, and he put up this whole exhibition in the senior citizen center. We worked in community art spaces, in churches, galleries, museums, and so on and on and on. We set up a billboard in one city before Election Day. We had postcards. I'll never forget the experience of walking into my local post office and seeing a woman with like 20 postcards that I had left in a store at the post office, writing her friends and email and sending them in the post office. So these things, for me, was like a completely new experience, something I never felt or was able to achieve by just working with magazines. Okay, so why it worked. It was the right story at the right time, meaning it was no one had done it, no one was doing it. It was this necessary story. Today still, veterans care is a huge issue. A veteran commits suicide in the United States every 21 minutes. There was no stated political position. The photographic aesthetic was original and unique and made sense with the work. I was committed to it through the long run. And the subjects were willing to be photographed. And I had Robert as a great partner. So this gave me tremendous confidence. One, it made me feel as though I could continue this work on this subject. Two, I became an expert. I knew as much about veterans care and veterans issues as people working for NGOs. So I ended up, over many years, still to this day, working this story, and I made this other series, which I'm not going to go through, but this became a very famous picture. And so, but I'm showing it now because if it wasn't for that initial grant and that experience going around the country, I don't think I would have felt propelled to keep going at it. And now I want to show you this other body of work. In 2010, I started looking at completely different issues, shale gas drilling and fossil fuel consumption. I read a story that New York City water supply could be poisoned by something called fracking. I had no idea what fracking was. Do people know what fracking is? Hands up. Okay. This is a map of shale deposits around the world. So where you see these colors, the likelihood is people are drilling. So what happened is that Halliburton came up with a technique years ago about how to drill for natural gas. It used to be you just drill down.
and then the gas comes up. Now you drill down, you drill sideways, right, like this, and then you pump water, chemicals, and sand, and you explode the shale rock that way. So you basically get a much bigger bang for the buck. So you're drilling down and then sideways. This has become hugely popular in the United States and other parts of the world, and it's very controversial because of the amount of water required. It's 4 million gallons of water for one well, and some states have 10,000, 15,000 wells. Okay. All of the diesel fuel, and then the pipelines, and then the methane emissions, and the whole, I came to see it as quite a monstrous process, but I didn't know that going in. I was just investigating. And it was close enough to my home, about 2-3 hour drive, where I knew I could work on it for a while. So this is the deposits in the United States. And I worked in a little place, so this is New York, and I worked mainly here in Pennsylvania. I first started by finding the activists, and honestly, I didn't know what they were talking about when I began. The science was very confusing to me. I didn't know what was going on, but I saw that people were pretty crazy and upset. So I kept on with the activists, and I had people start giving me tours. When your water is contaminated, you get something like this in front of your house called a water buffalo. So that was a big clue into people's homes being contaminated through the process. And then I started finding people in the midst of this contamination. At this point, the main narrative was that fracking was great, that it's going to, that it's clean, that it's going to give jobs to the United States and the American worker, and that this should be embraced. So people were lighting their faucets on fire from the methane in their water. This is someone's tap water. These pictures took a long time for me to get. I had to work with a lot of different sources. I had to develop relationships with people on the ground. I had to go back many, many times, maybe 50, 60 times. People were finding their children with rashes. In this part of the country, if your water, the value of your house is connected to your water supply, it's a well. So if your water goes bad, your house is worthless, because who wants to buy a house where there's no water? So the only way people could leave is sell your house to the gas industry. So they started calling themselves gas refugees, the people who would leave. Animals would get sick. Like military recruiters going into schools, the gas companies would go into the schools. They would provide coloring books to the children so that you would learn at an early age about the wonders of this process. And I remember now as a child, like all the funny little animals that were connected to Exxon and Sunoco and all of the gas industry, and the oil industry when I was a kid, and then it made sense to me. People started finding methane in the river. Photographically, it took me a long time to find my way into the project. And I realized that it was the pictures at night that really got to me, that were spooky, that had this David Lynch quality, where you'd be driving and driving through these beautiful little rolling hills and see nothing. And then all of a sudden, the sun would go down and the sky would go black. And then you started to see where all the rigs were, and you started to see the flaring in the sky. So that orange is from methane flaring. So I would kind of scout these areas late at night. This is a process that only happens for about 7 days. So I would have, all of my sources on the ground. They'd say, yeah, they're doing flaring, and then I would try and get out there. These are all the trucks lined up to collect water from the river. So I was pretty much working this story alone. And then I discovered that there was a group of local Pennsylvania photographers that were organizing themselves. And together we became something called the Marcellus Shale documentary project. The Marcellus Shale is the region of shale gas production. And by unifying, we had a far bigger impact. So from some foundation grants, we were able to create these large, very beautiful exhibitions with one cultural partner, and we were dedicated to moving them all around the 5 states of this Marcellus Shale. So we were focused very intensively on the local situation. I'm going to show you a little bit of kind of what that exhibition looks like, but let me just show you one other thing. Locals were documenting their own world. They were taking their own air samples and water samples, and they had some very good media. So initially, as a journalist, I'm thinking that I'm in competition with them, but I'm not. I'm in collaboration with them, and that was a switch that I had to make, which was really important. So someone had a special camera which sees hydrocarbons and methane. I started using that. This is actually a mosaic of a photo I took of a drilling rig and 1,800 little clips from a camera that was set up in front of a woman's house, documenting all the trucks that went by her house while they were fracking a well. She had over 1,000 trucks in 24 hours. So this is a close-up. Every one of these is a time-coded little shot. And so, you know, for a lot of this project, I was kind of frustrated. Well, the locals are making all this great media. How can I compete with that? What can I do that's different? And this is a challenge that we are all going to have as citizens start making their own media. And that doesn't have to be competition for professional journalists. It can be a huge benefit. And I learned this when I created this picture, right? Because I didn't set up this camera. A local set up this camera. So this was our kind of distribution collaboration. We had this Marcellus Shale documentary project, 6 photographers. And again, what the exhibition did is it brought in press. We would have, you know, universities would bring in their science class, or we would go to elementary schools or middle schools. These very sort of unsexy little events, to me, are hugely important, because these are the things where people really understand and learn. And I would go to many of these, the openings of the exhibitions or little community forums, and the people in the room didn't know what fracking was. It wasn't like we were speaking to the choir. We were speaking to educate, and people were there to be educated. And it's also because we never said we are for or against. We said, this is what we have discovered. We have no vested interest in this one way or another, but this is what we have discovered. So I think that that's very important. I'm not going to bother with that, but these are just some of the exhibitions. And then, of course, people want to do stories about our documentary project. So we had stories in the New York Times and Wired and Slate. You know, people in New York State that were just considering whether to approve or ban fracking would look to us. They would want to know our experience. And so I truly believe that our work helped in the broader conversation to take a critical look at this process. And New York State has not approved fracking in New York. So these were some of the publications. How am I doing on time? Good? Okay. So I'm going to show one other thing, something quite different. But for those of you interested in installation, big photo installations, this is a project that I did in 2013, 2014 at the Zatari refugee camp in northern Jordan. And I'll just read you a bit about it. So in July 2012, the first Syrian families arrived at the Zatari camp in northern Jordan. It's a barren strip of land, 12 kilometers from the Syrian line, about 70 kilometers from Amman. The time it was open, Andrew Harper, The UNHCR representative in Jordan said, quote, "We are the first to admit that it is a hot, desolate location. Nobody wants to put a family who has already suffered so much in a tent in the desert, but we have no choice." By the end of that summer, the camp housed over 10,000 refugees. In March 2013, it had 153,000 people in a space marked out for 113. Became Jordan's fourth largest city and the second largest UNHCR camp in the world. In July 2013, U.S. Secretary John Kerry arrived by helicopter on a camp visit, and an Agence France press photographer made this picture. And this became the image that went viral. Okay, the people appear as dots, little specks kind of in brown sand, organized in a grid with no end in sight. The image spoke to the enormity of the refugee crisis. It was very powerful. It was also completely impersonal. So as the Zatri camp grew, the security architecture evolved. Once inside Zatri, the first view is of this wall. 2.44 meter high barbed wire wall, stretching 120 meters along the camp's main internal wall. The wall leads to a fenced-in base camp, offices of the NGOs, and UNHCR. A second series of walls encloses the base camp, creating a visual boundary between the camp residents and the administrators. I had a friend working at this camp, and he sent me a picture of the wall. He goes, "You should see the security wall." And so what this wall did very quickly is made the camp look like a prison. Already, Jordanians were very suspicious of who was in the camp because they couldn't see people in the camp. You have to get permission to enter the camp. And so there was a lot of hysteria and mystery about who were all those people in that camp. And then you have this wall. And so I came up with an idea to turn the wall into a mural. And so in late 2013, 2014, I took 3 colleagues. All of us had experienced photographing in refugee camps. And we just went to make images of daily life. Normally when journalists go into refugee camps, they just take pictures and then they leave. Sometimes they talk to people, sometimes they get names, sometimes they get permission, but most often not. This was a project where we had to have explicit permission, right? We didn't go in there and just shoot willy-nilly. We went in there and we talked to people. This is the idea. We're going to put your face and your situation super large on this wall so that when visitors come, often visitors to Zatri never get out of a bus. They go into base camp, they're brought in a bus, they circle the camp, maybe they have a scheduled little sit down with one particular refugee, and that's it. When we arrived, we were also told, yeah, no one likes journalists, be careful, they'll throw rocks at you. So there is a little bit of a demonization going on by the administrators and staff of the refugees themselves. Okay? And so the idea with the wall was, let's show these people larger than life, because every single person in that camp has an epic story of survival. Every single one. If any of you have ever talked to a Syrian refugee, it is a humbling experience. And so we spent a week. The project borrowed some of the visual language of photojournalism, but required consent and collaboration. The images had to strike a particular truth. They had to negotiate the space between the grim reality of the camp and the project's intent to use art as an affirming medium in spaces of disenfranchisement and trauma. This man was tortured for 3 months. He was a taxi driver. Only Syrians are allowed into Zatri. If you're a Palestinian who fled in 1948 to Syria, you are not allowed in. If you're an Iraqi who fled to Syria after the Americans came in, you are not allowed into Zatri. This man was married to a Sudanese woman, and they held them and their family for weeks in this cage while they were waiting for Sudan to give them safe passage. We looked for different kinds of things. We looked for more positive things. This is a very big day in Zaatari camp when people moved from their tents to these container houses. Women did not want to be photographed. Most of the Syrians in Zaatari come from a very traditional part of Syria, so how do you shoot that without showing their faces? Daily life on the main street. I mean, older women do allow their faces shown, and she agreed. So, one of the photographers, Alexander Fazina, wanted to photograph births. Zaatari is a population bomb, right? So, what else do people do when they have nothing to do? So, these are triplets, a month old. So, we made these pictures, and then we went back to the wall, and I had them printed in Jordan, and then we started to put them on the wall. And I've never felt a moment of more responsibility in my entire career. I was terrified, actually, how they would be viewed if people would come and pull them down. If we made a wrong picture, you could set a riot off in this camp. If we had put a picture of a woman's face, if her husband didn't agree or she didn't agree, we could easily set a riot off of the camp. This picture was of two fighters. They completely agreed. They understood it, exactly what the purpose was, how it was going to be used. And then once it was on the wall, one of the people in the pictures came out, and he got too nervous and embarrassed. And so I covered the picture. The Jordanian authorities who actually own the wall were not told. It was an oversight, or so I was told. And so this picture went up on the wall, and a policeman said to me, that picture is going to make people think that he was wounded inside the camp. Okay? Actually, he's showing x-rays of his torture from when he was in Syria. So it became this very bizarre negotiation as the pictures are going up, where the police would go picture, picture, and I would go next to the police and try and advocate for these pictures. So this picture was allowed to stay. This picture they completely freaked out at, and we had to cover. This picture is of food distribution, which is an unbelievable scene at Zaatari camp. And again, I was told that this picture is going to make people think that people inside the camp are poor. Okay, so you can understand how complicated this kind of installation is, because the host country doesn't want to feel humiliated. You don't want to be doing some, puff job to show that everything is great in the camp. You don't want to show people in any kind of humiliating position. So it was very, very tricky. This picture, he's writing a caption on the wall in Arabic explaining that these men are building an approved washroom because bricks are not allowed in the camp. The whole kind of irony of Zaatari is that the Jordanians don't want a permanent structure, but in fact, this camp is never going away. And so the question was that people will think that they're building this illegal settlement, right? This picture I decided not even to put on because it would be too provocative. So the other thing that we did, this is how the wall looks. The pictures were protected by the camp residents. As we were putting them up, people driving down were honking their horns. It felt like an opening, right? Like something was happening. Something positive was happening. And so the success was basically if the pictures were not destroyed. That's how I saw the success. The other thing that we did was we set up a photo booth. Right, so this is the view then that you drive. Instead of seeing the concrete wall, you started to see people. We set up a photo booth, and we made hundreds of pictures on the spot. people coming with their families, and we printed them out, and we just gave them to people. And the idea was to have people have a picture of themselves that was not them as a refugee, but just as a picture that they could like. So we didn't take pictures at the tent. We wanted to make it outside of that refugee narrative. And these are some of the pictures. And this was, I think, some of the most fun I ever had as a photographer, taking these pictures. The instruction to residents was, you can bring something or someone you love, or come as you are. So he brought his blanket. And he brought his son. And he brought his shisha. Yeah. So these pictures we don't publish unless people had signed off saying that we could publish them. These I'm just showing you here today. So then I took the installation to New York at a photo fair in Brooklyn, and we took it to the UN. And I think I would have liked to have taken it elsewhere, but my energy ran out, and the money ran out. And then it was published in various places. And this is what the wall looks like now, 2 years later. So at first I was very frightened about this, of it looking like this. And then I realized that these kinds of installations become part of the ecosystem. And now I see photographers shooting in Zatri where the wall becomes an indication of how old the camp is and how long people have toiled there. And these are the other photographers involved. So thank you very much.
Nina Berman, thank you very much for sharing your live achievement with us. This was a great privilege for us, I think. And some of your pictures are iconic, even in this part of the world. And it's, you should know it. You know, Slovakia was involved in the war in Iraq and in the war in Afghanistan as well. So this is also our story in many ways. And we had so many questions, but no other presentation. So behind
great.
you. Well, first of all, there were more questions dealing with the topic of the reaction of the corporate-controlled media to your work. Did you ever experience any sort of what we would call censorship? We have long experience with censorship in this part of the world, but you have it in the U.S. in a different way,
kinds,
in different line. So was there any way, you mentioned, I think the big topic of your work is, so to say, this leaving the traditional media and trying new ways how to present your work, how to get to the bottom ground approach to audience. So maybe you could talk a little bit about this.
I think that what happens with my work is that I'm onto something maybe a couple of years before other people are onto it, or maybe a year before other people are onto it. So there's a little bit of this period of time where the work isn't understood or not accepted or appreciated. And then at some point, hopefully it becomes, part of the media landscape. So this was definitely true with Purple Hearts. In some degree, a photo editor said to me, Nina, even though she'd given me some money to do the work, she said, Nina, we will never publish your pictures. They're too depressing. The fracking story, these pictures are published now, but the mood of the country has changed. So there's never been a time where someone has said, that picture is too explosive. It's just they ignore it.
Okay, so you mentioned it a little bit in the last part. There was a question when you said publishing of your stories in the magazines, the big magazines, is not anymore the thing you dream about. It's not the measure of success. So you said a little bit about what's satisfying now for your work. So how would you maybe describe it? It seems like you are trying to be engaged in many public issues. It seems like you're trying to be an active citizen in a way, be a critical thinker. Is this? Did we get it right?
Yeah, I think for me it's balancing two things, is that I want anything that I do to also be photographically challenging for me and interesting. So in the art space and that process, I have to feel as though I'm pushing myself creatively. And then it has to be about an issue that I feel strongly about, to dedicate that time and also to experiment and be willing to fail, right? So you have to be willing to fail as a creative person, or else you're not going to get anywhere new. And so, and then the other aspect is I spent so many years being told to not bring your subject into the process of figuring out the story, right? That we are neutral observers, journalists, and that we are just kind of flies on the wall. But I really, really question that. And I want to know, like if I was doing Purple Hearts again, I would ask them, how do you want to be photographed? Let's see, is there a picture you want to make of yourself? And I would find a way to include that in the picture I want to make of them.
Mm-hmm. Aren't you afraid that your stories without any normative anchor could and can be misunderstood for being bad or...
I don't understand that question. Can you help me understand that question? Yeah. Yes.
I mean, whether your projects kind of devoid of normative meaning, saying Franklin is bad or war in Iraq was bad, whether it cannot be misunderstood as used for the opposite thing you wanted or something. Mm-hmm. Does it just really put yourself out of it? Just show it?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I'm willing to take some of that risk because people have used the pictures in different ways without my permission. I'm very rigid about how the pictures are used. So even to this day, if someone wants to use a Purple Hearts picture, they can't just publish it. I have to know the context. I have to know the story. I want to know the headline. And this allows me to protect the integrity of the picture. Because if you don't do that, then the pictures lose all meaning. Right? They just become what anyone wants at any moment in time.
There's a question concerning the portraits you did of the veterans. Mm-hmm. Do you always need some sort of a contract with these people, some model release with the subjects you are photographing?
Yeah, I do. If I'm in someone's home, they let me into their home, I ask for model release. Yeah.
What is the most important element while they disappeared while telling the story, or?
What, I'm sorry?
This question just disappeared, but we could gonna scroll to it. Did you also cover some story of homeless veteran?
I haven't, although I see them in New York City all the time. I wanted to cover the story of women who were sexually assaulted. And this was a story I pitched in 2005, and no one wanted to do that story. And now it's, a very big story and big news and everything else. But what tends to happen with my work is that I'll stay super engaged up to the point where other people are onto it. Once other people are doing good reporting, I'm happy to move on to do something else. So if someone has done a great job on a subject, I'll never do that story. Because I feel why should I spend this short amount of time I have on this planet when someone else has done such a great job already? Why should I bother doing that?
Mm-hmm. There's a question, what would you suggest for a photojournalist when he wants to express somehow a less visually attractive topic? For example, corruption or no rule of law, for example. Right. What could be the way how to visualize this?
Yeah, this is the hardest thing, I think, facing us, because so many corrupt practices are invisible, right? And so making the invisible visible is a huge, enormous challenge. And I think that you have to not focus on necessarily the individuals participating in the corruption, in terms of the photography, but what that corruption ends up resulting in, the consequences of that corruption, and then linking it back through data, through investigative reporting. So for instance, I did a story on sexual trafficking, and
ethical reasons and other reasons, I didn't want to do the photograph of the woman cowering, upset, right? So instead, I tracked down cases where the perpetrator had been convicted. And I found the evidence that the U.S. attorneys used to convict the perpetrator. And it took me months and months of research to get into, like 5 months, to get into a room for a half an hour where I would be presented with a few objects. And then I'd photograph those objects, and then I'd find the locations of the crimes, and I put together a series of pictures called object lessons, which tell that story in a kind of chilling, creepy way, right? With then testimony from the trial. And this way I didn't have to re-traumatize the victim by asking, and then what happened, and then what did he do, and how many times did this happen to you? So there are ways, but you have to be, really, really think about it.
Nina Berman, thank you very much for your answers. I'm a little bit afraid that with your new president you will have a lot of work still to do. Thank you.